Welcome to the IO Edge, where industrial organizational psychology meets the fast-paced world of modern HR. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Minor. This podcast is dedicated to HR professionals, managers, and IO psychologists looking to lead with insight, strategy, and confidence. Whether you're an HR professional looking to level up or an IO psych grad wondering where you fit in the business world, this podcast gives you the tools and insight to lead with purpose. On today's podcast, we will discuss leading through change, building resilience in the workplace. So joining us today on the IO Edge is our special guest, Dr. Juliette Nelson, an industrial organizational psychologist, educator, and entrepreneur who brings a powerful blend of research, real-world experience, and heart to this conversation. So whether you're navigating organizational transformation, supporting a team through uncertainty, or simply trying to stay grounded as a leader, this episode is packed with insight you don't want to miss. So grab your coffee, take a breath, and let's explore what really means to lead with resilience. So Dr. Nelson, I want to thank you for joining our podcast today.
And thank you for having me, Dr. Minor. Such an honor.
Well, I appreciate you accepting the invitation. So we'll jump right in. So on the first question, so how do you personally define resilience in the context of the workplace?
Resilience, I think resilience is basically the ability to bounce back in the face of change, of adversity, trauma, difficulty, but even more, I think it's the ability to prepare yourself to bounce back. And that's in how you care for yourself. That's in how you create a safe space for yourself and others to be able to navigate those difficult times. I often used to lean on resilience, on the first part of resilience, and then working in an organization where the mission is surrounding responding to unprecedented events. You kind of have to incorporate readiness in there. You have to incorporate wellness in there. You have to incorporate psychological safety, all which contribute to that ability, again, to withhold, to withstand, and to bounce back.
Okay. So what are some of the most common reactions you've seen from teams when faced with unexpected change?
I think folks panic a lot. That's the first thing. And you'll see varying responses. Everyone likes being used to what they're used to. And change is often uncomfortable, even if it's good. So that's usually the most common reaction. I think you find that people, how that looks, right, in a behavioral sense, it translates differently. So you have those who might take more of an assertive step forward. You have those who are more than likely to panic, to reach out to team members, supervisors, to vent. And some people may just go dark or go silent. They're not speaking. They just need time to process. You may even find leaders in the midst of being inundated, right, with what to do, what to say. Sometimes they withdraw, right, where they may overshare or not share enough in fear of evoking more panic. So I think there's just a very spectrum of behavioral outcomes that you find in the midst of change, but for the most part, you find fear. Now, when people are prepared to navigate change, yes, it's uncomfortable, but you find more of a we can do it, right? You find more that they're, even though it's uncomfortable, but people can be more proactive and saying, okay, well, we prepared for this, we're ready for this. How do we move forward? How do we use all of those things we put in place to move forward? So I've seen both sides of the coin.
All right. So Dr. Nelson, why do you think resilience is becoming such a critical leadership skill today, in your opinion?
I think resilience is such a critical leadership skill because that's almost the make or break to navigating change, especially unprecedented change. I think over the past few years, especially this year, we see that there have been drastic and significant shifts in the workplace, whether it's from a policy perspective, whether it's from layoffs or revenue or whatever the case may be. And so how you show up as a leader really sets the tone for how your team now responds to whatever those shifts are occurring. I think if your team happens to be working under the umbrella of human capital, it becomes all the more critical, right? Because we set the groundwork for how the rest of the workforce is also able to respond to that change. I mean, when you're looking at occupations such as emergency and disaster recovery, right? When you're looking at the police force, the military, the healthcare workforce, right? Where we had
Right.
COVID and all of a sudden there's this public health crisis that's coming that everyone's trying to learn on the spot again as a leader, how you show up in from a position of resilience, right? That
Mhm.
now translates into how your team and your workforce and your staff and so on and so forth are also able to show up for their customers, their
Right.
clients, their patients, etc.
Right. So those disaster recovery plans come in
Yeah.
very handy when we're dealing with
Yes.
having to deal with resilience in critical
Yes.
situations. So,
Yes.
from your
Absolutely.
personal insight, can you share a moment in your career where you had to lead through significant change?
Moment in my career when I had to lead through significant change. I prefer not to have titles, at least throughout my career, because I have to lead in different capacities as a business owner. I will say, however, as an organizational psychologist and the IO psychologist, you do have to step forward as a leader because you're an internal consultant, right? So you are also responsible for advising not only colleagues, stakeholders, but your leadership as well. I think in the federal workspace, without saying too much, obviously, I think everyone in some way or another is familiar with the amount of change that has had to happen. And I think one of the big challenges, again, you find is the panic among colleagues. And sometimes panic causes friction.
Right.
And I'm a person who needs time to process so that I don't panic. It's taken me time to learn to remain more on the calm side instead of being the first one to lose my cookies. And so I think from a leadership perspective, it was more from an accountability lens with my colleagues, right? Where
Right.
you're working alongside fellow IO psychologists, you're working alongside retention analysts, engagement analysts, and all of us now have a responsibility to in some way, some form, advise, consult, but also shift. And so for me, it was important to be able to hold my colleagues up in some way, shape, or form without saying too much, and also advocate for what they needed so that they can be able to function in their capacity. And I think that's one thing that is very important to me. It's advocating for one another on a team because
Mhm.
again, in times of change, people react differently, and sometimes some folks don't have the bandwidth, sometimes folks are losing steam, and sometimes there are those who are ready to go full force. And so for me, it was really looking at how I can show up for my colleagues, advocate for them, hold space for them, talk them through how we're going to navigate the waters together, and also think strategically as to, okay, how we make sure that nothing that we do ruffles any feathers and causes any adverse impact. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay.
Or
So
that's what comes
what
to mind.
Yeah, and that it's almost of a sense where you have to be the calm in the midst of the storm, but you're also having to manage your own emotions based on what's
Yeah.
happening around you in order to be the anchor or strength
Yeah.
for the colleagues that are
Others.
probably not sure, like, what in the world are we going to do now?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
right. So, what are some tangible ways leaders can foster resilience in their teams?
I think resilience begins with readiness. So, working again in spaces where change happens in an unprecedented way, you don't have control over when, how, or where it occurs. I think readiness is extremely critical. So that goes into training and education, right? If you recognize the mission and the type of work that you do, how do we ensure that at a minimum, everyone has some kind of tools and resources for them to navigate that change, right? So when you're looking at, again, in the military, the police force, in healthcare, education, right? And I think it's going across the board where unprecedented change occurs. What kind of training and learning and development programs are we instilling so that those who are, the first in command, yes, they're able to do those jobs, but those who are not used to being the first in command, those who are not normally the first to get called, that they're also equipped, they're also prepared for them to meet the organization's mission when called. Cross-functional training is also important, right? Where we're also being able to be familiar with what other functions do. I think cross-functional collaboration is also important because it really helps people to learn, again, how do they lean on each other? Who do they call for what when there's no time for all of the red tape? There's no time for all of the chains of command and so on and so forth. I think another thing is really cultural transformation, I'd say, fostering psychological safety. What my observation has been is you really see unhealthy work cultures will really show themselves in times of change, right? And that impacts your resilience. Where historically minoritized or marginalized employees, those with disabilities, neurodivergence, different sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, race, the list goes on. You'll notice how some people will withdraw, some people will be resistant, some people will isolate. And again, that all contributes to that sense of resilience and our preparedness, right? When people feel that there is psychological safety, that they're within an organizational culture that allows them to be themselves, that allows them to learn, that allows them to contribute ideas, that allows them to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, that allows them to say, hey, something's not right. I think that also helps with resilience, collective and holistic resilience on an organizational level, because now people do feel comfortable with standing in the gap for each other instead of kind of butting heads, right? I think it also builds trust where we now recognize a leader who does see us as human beings, right? And so we can lean on that leader to really pave the way instead of telling that leader how they need to address whatever the issues are in order for us to be resilient. So those are a couple of things that I would say are necessary, and really, again, addressing issues head on. I think I've observed, and research does say that sometimes for the sake of trying to find the safest way to say this, for the sake of compliance, legal compliance, PR, right?
Yes.
A lot of things go unspoken about. A lot of things go under the rug, right? And I think, again, we can talk psychological safety, where if there is a safety hazard, if there's data that's not being accurately reported, if there are ethical concerns, whatever that is, right? If there are gaps in policy, in procedures, in timelines, whatever that is, we find that now all of that stuff blows up in the case of change, unprecedented change. And then now as a leader, because people were so afraid to say, no, this is a problem, or you were so, so big on protecting image and not letting, or not getting in trouble or not getting caught or whatever it is, instead of just addressing these issues when they come, now you're not only having to deal with the change, but also the crises that come along with that change. So I think that's also important, looking at what the bottlenecks are, looking at what the gaps are. We have, for
Mhm.
example, Six Sigma projects, making sure that we're making our processes lean, but we're making them efficient. We're looking at quality and we're constantly evaluating things. I think the time of just because it's broken, we don't fix it. I think those times are gone, right? Okay, there are some things that don't need to be fixed if they're not broken, but are there ways we can enhance them, right? So that again, when change does occur, we're ready to withstand the change. Sometimes the changes are just organizational changes. I don't know. We're coming up with a new system, right? But again, when there are challenges within the organizational culture, when there are challenges in processes and so on and so forth, it makes it difficult for our folks to adjust to a new software or to adjust to a policy because there were issues that we chose to ignore beforehand. So those are some of the things that, again, that I would say are important for a leader to consider when building resilience among their workforce.
And I think some of the points that you made actually are ways that organizations can embed resilience into their
Yes.
culture.
Yes.
So
Yes. Yes.
instead of just talking the talk and not walking the walk, a
Mhm.
lot of those things that you mentioned can be implemented to further embed into the culture to assist with the resilience or building
Absolutely.
resilience with the team.
Absolutely.
I always believe that transparency builds trust because if employees know that you're going to be honest with them,
Yes.
then it's a lot easier for them to quote unquote buy what you're selling.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I would even like to add, if I may, the
Mhm.
importance of that emphasis on employee wellness. I think it's a cute word that organizations like to toss around. Oh, we have an EAP
Mhm.
program and
Right.
we have, what is it, the Headspace app, and we have all of this fluff. But it's a lot of lip service, right? It's just, oh, we have these apps and these tools and you can use them whenever you
Mhm.
want, but we don't legitimately make an effort to promote
Right.
employee wellness and well-being. And I think that's another thing. Workplace trauma, organizational trauma is a real thing, right?
Mhm.
And trauma reactions also can happen in the midst of change, and they can impact our resilience as well. Employees are not immune, employees are susceptible to it as much as leaders are susceptible to it. And I think when we're able to focus on employee wellness, to your point, there's
Mhm.
also more trust in you because I know that you care about my well-being. And as we're
Right.
navigating change, you're also going to assure that to the best that you can, right?
Right.
People
Right.
are in a position where they can navigate the waters, where they can contribute to and maintain resilience amid change, organizational change. So,
Right. Because that was leading into, the next question in regards to some
mhm.
common mistakes leaders make when trying to push through change.
Yeah.
I've always believed in making sure to tell people the what, where, when, why, and how to a
Yes.
degree that you can release the information.
Yes.
Because that way it takes the mystery, or as you
Hmm.
were referencing, fear
Yes.
out of things to where they have a clear understanding and buy-in
Yes.
into, hey, well, how does this fit into what I'm doing? Or
Right.
them be able to take some ownership.
Yes.
Employees can really dig in and take some ownership and say, you know what, I'm helping the organization
Right.
with steering the change or being or
Right.
championing the change that's happening because they have a full understanding of
Yeah.
what it looks like. And
Yeah.
trying to be resilient
Hmm.
through a lot of the dynamics, especially with COVID,
Yeah.
that has tested the level of resilience for every organization.
Hmm.
So, do you think that there is a myth, or is there a myth about resilience that you wish more people would unlearn?
Resilience means being strong. I'll give an example. When people die, what do we usually tell the grieving folks? Be strong. I'll pray for your strength. Why? Someone passed away. Why do I need to be strong when I've lost someone who's so close to me? Right?
Right.
Or when someone's going through a painful period. And I can understand the intention, right?
Oh, of course.
Really praying that they can weather the storm that way. But sometimes I think resilience means being human. And when you can take care of yourself as a human being, I think that's how you build your strength. My team, one of my team members, she's a certified EAP counselor. Shout out to Dr. Katina Oates. And she's also an IO, but she's had experience in doing resilience training in the military, right? Where again, you're having your mental health challenged, especially when you're going out and serving the country. But one thing she emphasized is what happens is when we're not taking care of ourselves, right? We're not recognizing the human beings that have to stand amid whatever it is, we're breaking down our ability to be resilient. So I think this myth or this concept that resilience just means like, I have to convince myself that's what I'm feeling or the pain that I'm experiencing or the frustration or the anger or the fear, that it's not real. And I have to just push through it and be strong. I think language is important. And there are opportunities for us to look at resilience in a sense of taking care of ourselves, look at resilience in a sense of being vulnerable, as you said before, being transparent, being human, right? And being able to take care of ourselves as human beings. So that allows us to weather whatever the storm is.
Right. Because I think as we look at the future of work and some of the trends that are shaping how we lead through change, those are some key components, in my opinion,
Yes.
that
Yes.
should be incorporated to help further
Yes.
reinforce the need for change, being resilient through, different things. At no point did anyone have a pandemic on their radar. And this was something where a lot of businesses, organizations, companies were not resilient enough to weather the pandemic or come out on the other side.
But I
So
think
it's
there are
not.
those that convince themselves that these don't affect us, right? Versus being transparent about the fact that, yes, we are affected, right? I'm aware of an organization, I would say, an organization where at first there were reports, and I think a number of people have shared similar stories where you have some organizations where there are reports, COVID cases being reported, and then all of a sudden COVID cases are not being reported. And all you're seeing is people showing up in PPE gear and walking somebody out, right? And us acting like there's not a problem. We're immune to this until now everybody on the floor or in the department or whatever the case may be is coughing, sniffling. And now we have a larger problem on our hands instead of us, again, being human, recognizing that these are not robots, right? That are not going to experience fear. I think when we look at change management models as well, that's part of it, right? Acknowledging the human beings, acknowledging the fear, acknowledging the apprehension, making sure that we're communicating, right? Making sure that we're addressing concerns, answering questions, and so on and so forth. So,
yeah. And I think you make a very good point when you're mentioning, mental health or wellness, because,
yes.
I work in healthcare and I believe we are still in the midst and throes of recovering
Yes.
from the fallout from COVID. And I say that to say this regarding staffing shortages. So there's still a number of hospitals throughout the region in the country who are still trying to recover staff, or rebuild their staffing after this very traumatic experience.
Yes.
And I think organizations, especially with ours, have had to really put on very different thinking caps in regards to helping those persons who are left to be able to be resilient and being able to address or identify if we're looking at burnout with the persons who are remaining.
Yes.
And I do feel that that's something, based on cases I've seen come in through our employee relations department, I do feel that we're looking at some level of burnout for those persons who are still here, especially in our behavioral health departments. I think that they have probably taken the hardest blow.
Absolutely.
So with that said, what advice would you give to emerging leaders who want to build resilience in themselves in others?
I would say first, start with the human in you, the human being in you. It's okay to be firm, but it's also okay, and it's also okay to be human. I would say, in terms of building yourself up as a leader who can incorporate resilience, be okay with admitting that you don't have all the answers, right? Be okay with when one thing, for example, when projects are complete, and I mean, we do this in research, right? When we conclude our research, what were some of our limitations? What are our research opportunities for further research, right? What are these implications for the practical side, for the workforce? And I think for a leader, being able to sit down and say, okay, what did we learn from this project, right? What are some of the things that we can continue into the next thing? To your point about healthcare, right? My concern, and this is not just for the healthcare sector, but also for the education sector, whether it's higher education or K through 12, and for other sectors as well. There's not, your institutional knowledge gets lost. And I think that's where your resilience also gets lost, right? Because we're not necessarily learning from our mistakes. The pandemic kept everyone home for 3 years. And folks were trying to go back to normal, and normal was considered what was 3 years ago. The reality is every day we are not the same person we were the day before, right? Our experiences transform us so much. And a public health crisis as big as the pandemic that was global, right? We're never going to be the same. But what I observed is people were so stuck on going back to what used to be. You notice that now it's hard to move forward, right? To your point, you might have folks who are like, listen, I'm not doing this, I'm retiring. You might have sometimes even your best and your brightest talent, usually. And that's what research has shown. I facilitated focus groups, and that's what some of our data has shown, that you often have your best and your brightest who leave first. And when you're dealing with staffing shortages, your institutional knowledge is now gone. And so I think it's important that for an emerging leader to be like, listen, it is okay for us to be like, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? And what does this teach us moving forward? I think sometimes when negative experiences happen, we say, I don't want to talk about it. I don't. But sometimes it's important for us to sit in the discomfort. And I think as an emerging leader, that's another thing, being okay with sitting in the discomfort, being okay with asking for feedback, and recognizing that as a leader, not all the feedback is going to be positive feedback. People can look at the same situation and look at it in completely different lenses. And even if you may not agree, it does teach you how to move forward, right? It teaches you the different personalities you might be working with. It teaches you about what people need for them to be able to, again, exhibit that resilience. Resilience is not only up to the leader, right? They set the example, but everybody else also has to be resilient. And so if resilience, again, looks like you just being strong and you not answering questions and you feeling like you're carrying everything on your back instead of in advance getting to know your employees, getting to know your teams, getting to know what they do, being okay with saying, I don't have all of the answers, being able to consult your consultants, right? And also bringing your subject matter experts in to say, okay, we finished this project, no matter how small, how large. What were some of our wins? What are our opportunity areas? What do we learn for how we move forward? I think that's very critical for those who are trying to go into leadership positions. I think another thing is, again, build on those leadership skills, right? We sit in leadership classes and we learn about different leadership styles, but we learn them kind of in silos. We learn them in isolation of each other, right? Servant leadership, authentic leadership, transformational leadership, and so on and so forth. You don't want to be a pseudo transformational leader because those exist, right? But you can also, these different types of leadership can cross each other, right? Sometimes you need to take a more transformational approach. You should always be authentic. And sometimes you need to be the servant leader who does the grassroots thing. I know for my team and my company, I'm not above anybody, and we're a small business, right? So yeah, somebody might have a task, but my team very much knows that they can come to me and say, hey, I'm having trouble thinking through this. And I'm happy to sit down and say, okay, let's do a brainstorm session on how we move forward. So again, being able to pull on your resources, your human resources, the intellectual capital beyond yourself, admitting that you are a human being, you don't know everything. You can also admit that, whatever y'all are planning for, it can be scary, and it can be scary for you. It's okay to be vulnerable. It doesn't make you weak. So those are some of the things that I would recommend to an emerging leader. Really honing in, I think those are all parts of being emotionally intelligent. Also looking at psychological safety, inclusion. I think we live in a world where everybody thinks that inclusion or equity means that we're, what do they say? You rob Peter to pay Paul.
Right.
You're taking from one person to give to another. But what happens is when you can foster equity, when you can foster inclusion, it impacts everybody. If it's only, if opportunities are only being extended to one group of people, or if we're always looking at, if we're looking at the fact that the person with a neurodivergence or a differing ability, if they're getting certain accommodations and we're side-eyeing them all the time, and those are the things that they need to be able to perform and thrive the same way we're doing with less accommodations, if we're side-eyeing them, that impacts our ability to be resilient. And I think a challenge with the leaders as well is they may look at accommodations, right, or equity and inclusion and say, well, if I don't need it, why does this person need it? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with experiences that they may not have as much proximity to as maybe their team does. So I think psychological safety, inclusion, equity, those should always be top of mind. And those are values that an emerging leader should hold dear to them. So those are some of the things that I would say. And read books, read some books, friends, read some books. I think we're less empathetic because we just don't know about other people's lived experiences. Right. And so beside really adopting values and habits where you do sit with people and learn about them, also read, right? Read about other leadership skills and reflect on them. Ask yourself how this applies to you. Don't ever say, I would never, because you are not in that situation. And sometimes folks don't know what they'll do until they're in a specific situation. So I think also reading and asking questions and learning about what other leaders have done in the past, successfully or unsuccessfully, also helps inform how you build those values and then live out those values as a leader that promotes and fosters resilience in their teams.
Right. Because I think one thing that comes to mind for me is people need to allow themselves grace, because we do not always get this right. And when you cannot foster a sense of grace for yourself, I think that chips away at your level of resilience.
Yes. And when you don't give grace to others, they're not going to give grace to you, even if they know you're struggling and you're not admitting it.
Right.
And I think we see that where some leaders who are more cruel, who lack more grace, who lack empathy, when things happen to them, or when there is a situation where they really do need the grace, right? Or they do need the accommodation, or they do need whatever it is, folks don't have that compassion for them. And sometimes it's those people that directly report to them, and that doesn't make for a healthy team dynamic. Again, when you're facing change, and everybody does need to be on one accord.
So one last question for you. What is one book or resource that changed how you think about leadership? So one book or resource.
I love me a good book.
And you read so many, so it's kind of like you're going to have to try to choose.
I am. So I'll give a book. I will give a book. I'm trying to pause for a second to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'll give two. A book and a documentary that I just watched. So the book is Leadership and Self-Deception. I think it's by the Arbinger Institute. It starts with an A. I read it years ago, but it really transformed my life. And it basically explains, it's in a sense where we know what the right thing is to do, but instead of doing it, there's that second thought that comes in, right? Like good cop, bad cop, or the good angel or the little devil that's hanging on your shoulder. So we know the first thing that we should do. And then all of a sudden, the second line is, well, why isn't so-and-so doing it? Right. And what happens is we in turn deceive ourselves more than anybody else. And it turns into this vicious cycle. Right. And I think it feeds into the empathy, the lack of empathy or the lack of grace. And then what happens is it causes reactions from other people toward us. There was one example of a man who, when his wife just gave birth, they're both sleeping and their newborn baby is crying. The first instinct is wake up and, coddle the baby. The baby's crying. And the husband let a few more seconds pass, and his thoughts were, well, my wife knows I have to wake up to go to work the next morning. Why won't she wake up and coddle the baby, right? Why is she being lazy? Why is she sleeping through this whole thing? This is your baby that you gave birth to. You carried and gave birth to this baby. Why are you not getting up and really caring for the baby? And at that point, as the father of that child, as a leader in his home, he was deceiving himself, because you don't know what your wife, you probably more than likely were there with her, but internally, you don't know the internal battles she's facing, having had to carry this child, give birth to the child, and now there's breastfeeding, there's caring for the child throughout the day, staying home, right? Not having time to yourself, and so on and so forth. And so that was one really important example where it's like sometimes we just allow our brains to ruminate, where our pride takes over. And instead of forgetting to take care of our people, we become self-centered, and we forget that we do need our people, right? To be able to accomplish the missions. We do need to also stand in the gap for our people. So that's actually it's one of my favorite books to date. Now, in terms of a documentary, it's a recent one. And I identify with it from an organizational standpoint, having had experience, just kind of knowing things from the inside, not from that time, but just the functions in general. But Hurricane Katrina, The Race Against Time, it recently came out on Hulu. It's by Ryan Coogler, I believe his name is. And this is 2 decades ago. I lived in the Northeast, and I kept thinking back to what narratives I was fed. But I think watching this documentary also demonstrated leadership successes and leadership failures, right? You had some folks who were, folks who are responsible for deploying their workforce to bring support. And I'm talking immediate support. And they're like, well, this person needs to go to this 5-star restaurant in the French Quarters, and they need to enjoy their meal so that they can think properly. And then you have another leader who's really like, listen, don't draw guns on those people. These are peaceful civilians, and these are people who need support, right? These are not refugees. These are Americans. These are human beings. It doesn't matter what their socioeconomic status is. We need to make sure that we're serving and we're bringing them support. And you can see the difference between, again, those who saw the survivors as human beings, those who didn't, and also how these leaders were able to galvanize their teams, their staff, their workforce to be able to bring aid to people during an unprecedented time, right? When we're talking resilience, when we're talking readiness, even the levees that were breached, right? Safety hazard, things that were not addressed over time, people ignored it, right? They knew that it was a disaster, a crisis waiting to happen, and they ignored it until it actually happened. And so, you see so many different types of leadership. You see how teams and workforces respond during those times. You have to kind of prepare. I'm West Indian, so I always tell people, drink your tea, drink your water before you watch the documentary, especially if you have more proximity to it. I know for myself, I was younger, so I think that also horrified me, because I'm like, man, there's a lot that I didn't know that was going on in the background. But again, what stood out to me as an IO psychologist is seeing these different types of leaders play out, right? Being frustrated because they probably should have reached out to their human capital consultant, who would have told them, listen, these levies are not done. We got to fix them, or we got to make them right? Especially if these levies are supposed to be sheltering people who are living in socioeconomically underserved areas, right? So again, that's a documentary. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but that's a real good documentary that I would highly recommend, because it really shows resilience. It shows readiness. It shows looking at your teams as human beings. It shows looking at your customers and your clients as human beings. And it also shows how when leaders show up, that impacts how the entire workforce is able to accomplish their mission to those who need it.
Right. So you bring up Katrina. I'm actually married to a New Orleanian who was here
Ooh,
during Katrina, and
man.
we live here in New Orleans. So I've come to this region with a greater appreciation
Mm,
for the culture of people here who
yeah.
are resilient.
Yes.
This takes it to
Yes.
a whole nother level
Yes.
when it comes to being resilient. This is a true
Yes.
model of
Yes.
resilience is New
Yes.
Orleans.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
that is something where the anniversary has just
Mm-hmm.
passed,
Yes.
and it is always going to be celebrated in this city every
Yeah.
year. So there are large celebrations or commemorations of
Commemorations.
Katrina.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but that is a true example of resilience, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion.
Mm-hmm. I think the people themselves, the survivors themselves, teach us more about resilience and leadership than
Yep.
anybody else. I mean, you have young men who are, young women who know an aunt, an uncle is injured, and they're like, listen, they call them looters. For me, it's like, listen, windows are broken and so on and so forth. It's not stealing at this point. People need to be able to survive. But you saw that it wasn't stealing, it's gathering things that are left over that are not damaged so that they can serve the sick, so that they can serve
Right.
those who are dying, so they can serve the elderly, so that they can feed newborn babies. And I think that was and they remained calm. I think that's also, we spoke about the panic, right? Where
Right.
the news is saying, oh my goodness, they're violent, they're this, they're that. And then there were some people in the documentary officials with whatever authority who are saying, yeah, we got on the scene and it's just people who are patiently waiting.
Waiting.
People who are patiently waiting. Maybe they're coming and asking, when will we get aid? When will we get food? Or these
Mhm.
people are in need. But you see that there is still a level of poise that when you are in a situation like that, you should be panicking. As a human being, it's only natural that you would panic. So I think the survivors themselves, we have so much to learn from them. And, I respect for your husband and for everyone who was
Yeah,
impacted, because that shouldn't happen. But how they've been able to navigate, survive, persist, and continue persisting,
that's good.
despite it being 20 years after the fact is beautiful to me.
Yeah. So, Dr. Nelson, I want to thank you for
Thank you for
joining
having
the
me.
show today. And, hopefully we can pick up on the conversation at another time. But I
Absolutely.
also want to give you a shout out because this episode of the IO Edge was brought to you by January Publishing, which is owned by my colleague here, my fellow colleague here, Dr. Nelson. January Publishing offering a full spectrum of publishing services designed to help authors bring their stories and expertise to life. So learn more about January Publishing at januarypublishing.co. And so thank you for tuning in to this podcast. On our next episode, we will explore motivation and engagement, what actually works, backed by science. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Spotify to stay connected to the conversation at the intersection of psychology, business, and human resources. I'm Dr. Jacqueline Minor. I'll see you soon.